For thousands of years, we've been told the same story, that the pyramids of Egypt were built by slaves, that whipped laborers dragged massive stones across the desert, that brute force, suffering, and tyranny made the pyramids possible. It's a simple story, a dramatic one, and it's wrong. Because the real story of how the pyramids were built is far more unsettling and far more familiar. The pyramids weren't built with chains. They weren't built with whips. They were built with debt. Not debt. The way we think about it today, credit cards and interest rates, but something deeper, something older, something more powerful. A system where people worked willingly, believed they were being rewarded, and never realized they were trapped. A system that didn't just build monuments, it built obedience. And once you understand how it worked, you'll start to see echoes of it everywhere. Even today, with modern technology, rebuilding it would be extremely expensive and logistically complex. So for a long time, historians assumed the answer must be slavery, because slavery is the only explanation that feels proportional to the task. But archaeology tells a different story. Workers were paid, fed, housed, given medical care. They lived in organized villages. They had days off. They were buried with honor. These were not slaves. So the question becomes more uncomfortable. Why would tens of thousands of people willingly dedicate decades of their lives to building a tomb for one man? The answer lies in how ancient Egypt understood money, labor, and obligation. Here's the first thing most people don't realize. Ancient Egypt didn't use money in the way we do. There were no coins during the Old Kingdom, no wages paid in cash, no prices listed in markets. Instead, Egypt ran on a redistribution economy. At the center of everything was the state, represented by the pharaoh. The pharaoh owned the land, the grain, the animals, the resources. People didn't earn income. They were allocated rations, grain, beer, oil, clothing. Your survival depended on your relationship to the state. And this is where debt enters the picture. In ancient Egypt, the most valuable resource wasn't gold, it was grain. Grain was food, currency, tax, insurance. Every year, the Nile flooded, depositing fertile soil. But the floods weren't predictable. Some years were abundant, others were disastrous. So the state stored grain. And when times were bad, people borrowed from those stores. But borrowing came with strings attached, not interest, obligation. If the state fed you during a famine, you owed the state labor, not immediately, not violently, but eventually. This wasn't framed as coercion, it was framed as duty. Here's the genius of the system. You weren't forced to work, you were indebted, and debt doesn't need guards. It lives in social pressure, moral duty, fear of exclusion. When pyramid construction began, laborers weren't dragged from their homes. They were called farmers, whose fields were underwater during flood season. Craftsmen seeking stable rations. Families who owed grain to the state. Working on the pyramids wasn't seen as punishment. It was seen as paying back what you owed, serving the gods, securing favor in the afterlife. The pharaoh wasn't just a king, he was a god, and debt to a god isn't optional. The pyramids weren't just tombs, they were economic machines. Think about it. Tens of thousands of workers, massive food distribution, constant logistics tool, production housing, administration. This required record keeping, accounting planning, forecasting. In other words, bureaucracy. The pyramid projects allowed the state to absorb surplus labor, control population movement, redistribute resources, reinforce loyalty. And every block placed wasn't just stone. It was a reminder: the state feeds you, the state protects you, the state is eternal. This raises an obvious question. If this system was so exploitative, why didn't people rebel? Because from their perspective, it wasn't exploitation. The state didn't take from them, it saved them. During bad harvests, the granaries opened. During chaos, the pharaoh promised order. During death, the gods promised eternity. The pyramids symbolize stability in an unstable world, and stability is intoxicating. People didn't see themselves as trapped, they saw themselves as protected. Here's the darker truth. Once someone is indebted, they become predictable. They avoid risk. They obey rules. They don't challenge authority. Not because they're weak, but because they can't afford uncertainty. Ancient Egypt perfected this. By ensuring survival was tied to obligation, the state didn't need constant violence. It needed belief. Belief that the system was natural, the pharaoh was divine, debt was honorable. And when belief collapses, so does the empire. The pyramids weren't built for the dead, they were built for the living. Every massive stone structure sent a message across generations. This system existed before you, it will exist. After you, you are small, but protected. That's why they were oversized. That's why they were eternal. They weren't monuments to ego. They were monuments to control. Because once you understand this, you start to notice something strange. Debt that doesn't feel like chains. Work that feels voluntary. Systems that claim to protect you, while quietly owning your future. And suddenly, ancient Egypt doesn't feel ancient at all. When ancient Egypt finally declined, the pyramids remained silent, immovable, impressive. But the system that built them didn't disappear with the pharaohs. It adapted. Because once humanity discovered that debt could organize labor more efficiently than force, that idea never went away. It simply changed names. From grain to coin, the next evolution of control. As civilizations grew more complex, managing grain directly became inefficient. So something new emerged: money. At first, money didn't replace debt. It formalized it. In Mesopotamia, temples issued silver credits. In Rome, taxes were demanded in coin. In medieval Europe, peasants paid rents and tithes. But the structure stayed the same. Central authority controls the system. Survival depends on participation. Obligation replaces violence. The genius of money wasn't convenience. It was abstraction. Once debt was numerical, it could be measured, traded, expanded, inherited. And most importantly, it could feel personal. If you failed, it wasn't the system's fault. It was yours. Why modern debt feels different, but isn't. Today, when people hear debt, they think of student loans, mortgages, credit cards. And they're told it's a choice, but choice only exists when alternatives are real. Just like ancient Egypt. Education is required to participate. Housing is required to survive. Healthcare is required to live. And access comes with obligation. The system no longer feeds you grain. It feeds you opportunity. Miss a payment and you're not beaten. You're excluded. Your credit drops. Your options shrink. Your freedom narrows. No guards, no chains. Just consequences. The pyramid never went away. It moved. Look at modern society. A small number of people at the top, a massive base supporting them. Structures that take generations to complete. We still build pyramids. They just look like financial institutions, corporations, infrastructure, digital platforms. And instead of stone, they're built with data, labor, attention, time. The scale is different. The logic is identical. Why the system feels natural, that most powerful systems are the ones people don't question. Ancient Egyptians didn't ask, why does the pharaoh own everything? Because that was reality today. People don't ask. Why does survival require lifelong debt? Because that's reality. The system isn't enforced by fear. It's enforced by normalcy. And normal is the hardest thing to rebel against. The final parallel no one likes to talk about. The pyramids promised eternal life. Modern systems promise something similar. Retirement, security, stability, work, now sacrifice, now obey now, and someday you'll be free. But just like ancient Egypt, that someday always moves. So why does this matter? Because the pyramids aren't just history. They're a warning. They show us how easily humans will accept systems that protect them, feed them, organize them, even if those systems quietly own them. And the most unsettling part? Most people involved weren't villains. They were just doing what made sense. Inside the system, they were born into the real question. The pyramids still stand, not because they were well built, but because the idea behind them was. So the question isn't, how did they do this? The real question is, what are we building right now that future generations will stare at in silence? Debt didn't build the pyramids alone. Belief did. And belief is still the most powerful force humanity has ever discovered.